And without further ado, Erin Parisi is joining us here from TranSending. Erin is a climber, adventure athlete, incredible human being, and advocate for trans folks in the outdoors and beyond. So without further ado, welcome, Erin.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. I appreciate that. I definitely appreciate the invite to be here in front of this crowd. First, before I get going, I would like to take a moment to honor the shooting victims here in Colorado. I'm from Colorado, not far from Boulder, and also the victims from last week's terrible event that was aimed towards the Asian community in Atlanta. So I want to take just a few seconds of silence to honor and remember those folks that we lost in that violence for basically senseless violence. All right, thank you. So I'm just going to jump right in here and do my presentations. Basically, I never thought I would be here, and I had no idea that I'd end up in front of anyone, let alone this crowd. And that's because I think the world has a chance to define us before we have a chance ourselves to define who we are for the world. It's a boy. Those are likely the words that I was brought into the world on. And my invisibility kind of started from that moment forward. Of course, I don't remember hearing those words. I never was able to defend myself or say, maybe that's not true. I was kind of cold probably, and probably having a pretty rough day at the time. So basically just day after day, I grew up, and eventually I began to know just kind of life as I was being treated in kind of where I was born, which is middle America. You know, the expectations of my life were kind of born on that day. And that's really the start of me being defined and erased, going back that far. I grew up kind of the quintessential suburban life. It was an ecosystem where you not only knew your neighbor and your friends and their kids, you knew kind of the classes they went to, who their brothers and sisters were, who their family was. In my town, families were multi-generational. They were there forever. And at the same time, it was like the cornfields in my neighborhood, or my whole town, had begun sprouting like two-story homes and cul-de-sacs. And it really was the place where you knew everybody at church. And while that sounded very safe, it was only safe if you were the same kind of as everyone else. Our neighborhood and our community was very much a microcosm that said and proved the premise that you could be loved in a community as long as you were like everybody else in that community. It wasn't safe to be different. This was also an ecosystem of ongoing jokes about diversity. We made jokes constantly, or the people in the town constantly kind of made jokes about the fact that our diversity rested on a few families in the town. And anything that was ever viewed as queer was violently lashed out and talked about in terms that, you know, are hard for me to kind of reconcile at this point, because I hope that the people I was with didn't mean what they were saying about the LGBT or queer community, but yet every time something came up that was queer, it was well known that it was not only frowned upon, but there was kind of a violent reaction to it. So it definitely wasn't safe to be queer in that space. My family wasn't necessarily affluent in that community, and that meant a lot of things. We were a big family, but we didn't have a lot of the things the other kids had. So we learned to kind of ride our bikes around, and we learned to love the outdoors. We learned to find our home in the fields and the forests and the outdoor green spaces that we had kind of at our disposal in this big town. And that really gave me this love for the outdoors. And I tried to grow that love for the outdoors. And I always kind of found that space, you know, like summers were just riding your bike around, finding friends to play with, riding through the forest, like doing things like that. And that was really the space that I loved. It was all about athletics, and it was all about engaging friends through outdoors and outdoor activities. And as I got older, that grew. I'm from a snowy place, so I learned to ski. I learned to mountain bike, and those were all things I loved. And, body movement certainly became this thing that I really had this draw to. And that was really how I defined my life. But here I was in this town also where I couldn't be different at all or be seen as different. And I kind of lived with that. And when you're young, you can deal with things like that. When I looked around my town, there were actually other people that were a little bit different. I went to church with a woman who was trans. She had transitioned in the neighborhood that I lived in, and she lived in the community. And she wasn't going to move, and she shouldn't have had to, because she loved where she grew up, and she loved the town, and she loved being where she was. Why would she move? But at our church, even she was gentle, and she was unassuming. She was always peaceful, and she was very quiet. She really didn't ever feel, I thought, like she could speak up and be seen or heard. But yet somehow she took kind of some of the cruelest abuse I've ever seen an adult take in my circle. And that happened from adults and children. And that was one of the only narratives I ever saw firsthand of a trans person. Certainly, I also heard lots of comments about trans people that weren't there. It was like this narrative was being reinforced about trans people, but it was never being told about somebody who actually existed. It was just this idea of, or these derogatory remarks thrown at people that weren't even in the room. I never quite understood it. And I would say, this was the 90s. So bigotry was on proud display in society as a whole. Our society at the time had shows like Jerry Springer and Maury Povich, where they used to kind of bring trans people on stage, and the audience would boo and hiss and, get really rowdy, and they'd have these sensational storylines. And it was always kind of around a trans person that, again, was this narrative or the stereotype of what it was like to be trans. And this is kind of how we got to the definition of being trans. Along the way, there were also two huge movies when I was back young in high school. One was Silence of the Lambs. It was celebrated so much. It won 8 Oscars, and it was definitely kind of a trope on trans people being violent and kind of driven and motivated towards being criminals. And then there was another one that was Ace Ventura, and that one was particularly harmful. I remember my friends could quote every word of it. I was in high school and they loved it, that the juvenile humor in that movie was so great. And I remember in the end, the trans woman was outed, and they tore her clothes off in front of this whole police department. And everybody was so disgusted by her presence. They all puked. And there I was. That was who I was. I was standing there watching this movie, seeing these descriptions and these shows where, all of these narratives and this imagery around what it was like to be trans was being showed. And I got the idea, it was clear: be quiet, don't be seen, don't be heard. And that's kind of how stigma gets created, and that's how it gets kind of reinvented. The world developed a system that taught me how to hide, and taught me that I needed to hide in order to survive. They taught me that I was unlovable if I was ever seen. And there's also, they would reinforce that about a group that was never even around. There was nobody to break that narrative because there were no trans people around. So here we were making this whole narrative, and it was in the absence of any real trans narratives to be seen. So I can barely blame the world for developing this narrative for trans people, because in the end, I didn't know a trans person either. And I came to the same conclusion because of all these things that I had seen over the years. I would say for most of my life, every trans story I saw ended with death, violence, discrimination, in destitution, or alone on the streets. The idea of trans joy never existed. So that's where I kind of came from. My heart and soul knew, given that I was in that situation and how bad it kind of was in that small town, that I was going to need a bigger area or some sort of privacy or some way to get away and be safe and kind of become myself. I knew that from a young age, that I would need to probably escape. I never thought I might transition, but I needed to know that it was an option. It had to be like kind of that back door, that like escape route. I needed the peace in my soul of knowing that it was an option, and then I could maybe move forward. And that's what I did. I needed to break from those expectations, and I wanted to find more wild places and kind of grow on those, like the mountain bike and skiing experiences I had back in the Northeast. And I had to get away from the people I knew in order to have some freedom to kind of find myself. So I moved to Colorado, and it was kind of a weird choice because I think at the time, if you told somebody in the 90s that you were LGBT or queer and you needed to leave the small town, most people would say, well, you're probably going to go to New York or LA or San Francisco or Seattle or something. But I chose Denver. Honestly, I looked around, and Colorado had these laws that they had just put in place that were there to protect the trans community and the LGBT community in general. And while I wasn't out, I knew that meant some degree of safety. I also wanted to bike, and I wanted to ski, and I wanted to do all those things. I wanted these wild spaces. And lastly, when I went online and kind of did some searching, I found that Colorado had some supportive allies and resources for people like me. So it was important that those were in place, even if I never intended on using them, but to know that a community was at least open enough to accept and maintain amenities for people and services for people that, like me, made a difference. So I came out here, and sure enough, I did exactly what you think I would have done. I started a job. I went outdoors and I found life backcountry skiing and mountain biking, just bigger mountains and bigger lines. And I got a job that promised growth at a big Fortune 500 company. And I changed exactly nothing. And I even found love. So inevitably, kind of all those things added up, and I postponed my own transition. And instead, I tried to define myself with adventure, and I tried to define myself with travel and kind of outdoor stuff, and being in the mountains. It wasn't 100% happiness, but maybe if I could just scrape by a day at a time, one day at a time, one day at a time, that would be enough. And especially, I didn't want to have to choose. I never knew that you could have both. I never knew that there was a choice that you could be happy and be who you are, that you could choose your life that you want and also the things that you love. Basically, I had committed to hiding my entire life and doubled down on living the lie. I internalized what it meant to be trans in the world. I didn't even know what it meant, and what it meant to be a woman as well. And I knew I couldn't take that path if it meant being visible at all. The box that I drew was pretty tight around myself, and the way I defined myself was very tight, and eventually it got too tight, and I kind of ran out of space to run. The problem was that my life, again, was built on this bankrupt belief, and I had to choose between love and adventure and the outdoors, and choose manifesting in a body that matched my soul. Eventually, the happiness kind of left my days as time went on. And it became clear that I was really living to please everybody else, and I wasn't really living to please myself. And I think that that's when the foundation pretty much crumbled. One night, I was with my partner, and we were in the middle of the bathroom debate, and she took a supportive stance on it. So I said, all right, well, that's promising. I'm going to come out and just kind of test the waters. And I did. I said kind of who I was to my partner at the time. And pretty quickly, I was rejected. I kind of met my exact fear of what would happen, actually lived out, and it happened. We tried to figure things out, and it didn't work. So then I was alone. I didn't have her. And now I had to come out to my friends because nobody knew what was going on, and I was getting divorced. So I started coming out to friends, and I lost a few friends. And I started coming out to my family, and I lost some of my family. But still, transitioning was likely the last chance I gave myself for 3 decades. I had tried so many other things. I had tried conversion therapy. I had tried just being happy. I had tried doing it everyone else's way but mine. And here I was kind of at the brink of needing to do it my own way. At first, it didn't feel very easy. And And there was a lot of hard times. I was changing basically the way I was presenting in the world, and I was coming out to people one at a time, each time hoping that they would greet me openly, given only the fact that they had just those 10 seconds or 20 seconds that I verbalized to them to accept me. Or hopefully maybe just say, come back to me. I always hoped, if they said no, if they wouldn't want to be there on the spot, they would come back later and say, I thought about it and here we are. I slowly built a new wardrobe, which wasn't super exciting because basically I went from one floor at REI to the other floor at REI, and just kind of got all new outdoor gear. And I found after a little while, it was weird. Something happened that I didn't expect would happen because things had gotten so low. Basically, suddenly things started getting better. I wasn't living day to day unhappy anymore. I had lost some friends, and I even lost some family members. And I had lost one of the most important people in my life to me at that point. But now life was actually getting better. I was using the energy I used to use to kind of run and hide and fear myself, and instead pouring that into more productive relationships. Everybody I came in contact with knew 100% of who I was. When I went outside or went to work, I was showing up as myself. I didn't have the energy that I had to first put into being somebody else and then doing what I was doing. It freed me up to do a lot of different things. I moved past my sometimes chaotic transition. I was still very much in the middle of it, but mentally I was able to kind of get it under control, if you will, and get my person and who I was more in line. And I realized I needed to start looking outward and change things. I began to explore the false perceptions that had gotten me to the place that I was now, and that I had used to frame myself in this negative way that kept me hiding for so long and invisible for so long. I also wanted to know what had maligned society's view of trans people. How did that happen? How did I allow myself basically to be crushed by the bricks of society's expectations? And how did society make those bricks to begin with? The answer revolved around, I think, just being seen. It really came down to whether or not, just the fact that there were no positive trans narratives around the world. I had never known a trans person who was successful in the outdoors. That wasn't a possibility. The people I knew who were trans were on Jerry Springer. The people I knew who were trans were in these movies being made fun of. The people that I knew who were trans were, they were these images and these stereotypes that really didn't exist. And it wasn't the way that trans life was. So that's kind of where I decided things needed to change as far as my life went. Oops, excuse me. And I had to figure out how to make it the opposite. That's not how I wanted my life to be. I wanted adventure. I wanted to travel again. I wanted to climb mountains. And I wanted to tell the world that I was proud of myself for who I am. And I wanted to stand on the highest mountain and say those words. I wanted to scream it from the top of that mountain. I wanted to stand where there are no shadows and not care that I was trans and just say I am, and I'm proud of it. It was something I'd never seen anybody do, not make fun of trans people or not marginalize or stigmatize trans people, but to celebrate the narrative as who you are. So that's what I did. I set out to climb the highest point on every continent and stand proudly where there are no shadows, in completing a goal called the 7 Summits. The 7 Summits basically is a goal of climbing the highest point on every continent. I can name them, and I will. They're right behind me. You've got, where am I? Wrong side. Yep, that's Everest. Everest is up there at 29,000 feet. Right behind my head is Aconcagua. That is 23,000 feet. If I step this way, 20,000 feet, you'll see the third one to your left, I guess, is Denali. Then you've got Kilimanjaro, Elbrus in Europe, and Vincent's Massif, and then Kosciuszko. Those are the 7 summits. They were first climbed in 1984 by Dick Bass. He was an American mountaineer, and he set out to do it, and he kind of just said he was going to do it, and he had the idea and went and got it done in a couple of years. And he was the first known person to do that. It wasn't completed by a woman, believe it or not. As mountaineering works, it's kind of if you look at mountaineering as a whole, it's kind of a microcosm for equality and equity in the world. So it took a woman 10 more years after the Seven Summits was completed by a man to climb the same peaks. And that was Junko Tabe. She's a Japanese climber, and she's also the first woman to have climbed Mount Everest. And about 10 years after Dick Bass climbed the Seven Summits, it was done by a female. It took another 8 years, I believe, for a Black person to do it. South African, his name was, I'm not going to say it because I will butcher it, especially if it's not in front of me. But it took until 2012 for a woman of color to do it, or a Black woman to do it. So basically, you're seeing that the amount of time that it takes for people to do this kind of shows you, I mean, it's a very expensive endeavor. It takes a lot of commitment, it takes a lot of freedom in your life and the ability to break away. And as mountaineering is, it's often kind of an elite, an elitist activity. And it shows in kind of the times it took different people to do this goal. When I looked at the 500 people that had completed the Seven Summits, not one of them was trans. So I dug a bit deeper. 5,000 or so people have climbed Mount Everest about 12,000 times, if the numbers are right, and not one of them is known to have been trans. So here I was setting out on this goal to climb the Seven Summits and to climb Mount Everest. And I was looking for any example of somebody who had done it or had engaged this activity, and there wasn't one. As a matter of fact, even now as a woman, I was looking at the list of people that had completed it, and about 80% were male and about 20% are female. So again, you get this idea of the representation on who does this, who is able to complete these mountains. So that's how that goes. So I set out in 2018 because I wanted to kind of develop who I was and show the world who I was and show the world I was proud. And I had this big dream, but here I was without a passport. I definitely had a passport that would no longer work for me. So it was like this whole restarting thing. So I didn't know what was going to happen, but I filled out the passport application, and I had a new license and I had new social security card. So I sent the application in to get my new passport. And a couple of weeks later, I think I paid for it expedited. 4 weeks later, it arrived. And a couple of weeks after that, I headed out alone to Australia. It was the first time I went to Australia. And I figured I'd start there because it's a 7,000 foot peak. It's like one of the foothills here in Colorado. And I wasn't with anyone, but and I'd never been there, but I knew the language and I could speak and I could make my way around. I had a driver's license that would work and the driving was similar. And there were a lot of things I knew it was kind of a good way for me to reintroduce myself to traveling in the world. And I rented a little van, and I was just out of my divorce, and I'd been 2 years of coming out and stressful life, and of coming out and finding my friends and finding new footing. And here I was alone in a foreign country, Australia. And that was it. I mean, I had the best time of my life. I got in this van, I cruised down the beaches between Sydney and Melbourne, and then headed into the snowy range, climbed the mountain. And I guess I just enjoyed the beaches and the wine for another 2 weeks, and just journaled my way across the country. It's exactly what I needed at the time that I was coming out of that divorce. Then I set up the climb in Kilimanjaro, which is in Africa. It was about 2 or 3 weeks after I had climbed in Australia, and I had already climbed this mountain. So I was pretty familiar with the landscape in Tanzania, and that I would be able to get in, and I kind of knew the ground, how to make my way around and kind of what it would take to climb that mountain. So I still didn't have a lot of money, and I called the person that had provided my tour last time. It was somebody, or my climb last time, and it was somebody who was on the ground and had already had the connections and the resources and everything. So rather than call a big outfit and try to arrange something, I called kind of this person I already knew, and I said, "Hey, I'm the cousin of this climber you were with about 7 years ago and climbed this mountain, and he told me to call you and to climb the mountain." So he said, "Oh yeah, how's your cousin?" And he remembered me from 7 years earlier. And we had a good discussion about myself in terms of it being my cousin. And then I committed to going to Africa. Then I started to do the research on Tanzania, and I started realizing some of the problems with my Seven Summits plan. Tanzania is a country where being gay, LGBT in general, and being known for citizens is 5 years in prison if you're female and about 30 years in prison if you're male. There's been lots of violence, I think, towards the LGBT community, especially if you look at countries that border Tanzania. So Uganda, Rwanda, and even Ethiopia. There's countries that have had stiff penalties, if not the death penalty, for being gay in those countries. And here I was flying into the country again, and also going to somebody who kind of knew me. So really was in this place where I wanted to go and stand on the tops of these mountains and stand proud, but it wasn't so smart to go to the tops of these mountains and stand proud and be seen. So I went there and I kind of kept my head down and my eyes up, and I climbed the mountain. I was solo. I flew in, climbed the mountain and got to the top, and it was amazing. I had delay after delay trying to get the expedition going because it was just me and because it was kind of pieced together at the last minute. But somehow I had landed and gotten to the top of the mountain with all the delays and made it to the top on International Women's Day in 2018. I got to the bottom and kind of did the same trip I did 7 years earlier, and kind of saw the difference between what it was like to have gone into that country in my former life and go in there now. And it's pretty intense, and I don't have time probably to talk about it right now. But it was so fulfilling, honestly. It was so redemptive to have climbed that mountain again. I felt like I went to that mountain and climbed it for all the wrong reasons 7 years earlier. And here I was climbing and seeing the sunrise on Africa again 7 years later. And it was kind of in this new life. And I was so happy to be there. The next peak I did was Mount Elbrus, which is Europe's highest peak. It is 18,000 feet, and it's in Russia. The place in Russia where this resides is really close to Chechnya, and anybody who studies or watches the news and sees the news around Chechnya might have seen that lots of news that comes out is about a program of kind of harassment towards the gay men in that country or in that region of Russia. So there's a local kind of government that's hostile towards gay men, and they've kidnapped and killed several in the course of this kind of this homophobic crackdown. I was going in at the same time as the World Cup in 2018, and there was a lot of literature produced telling me how to live and make my way through the country as a tourist. And most of it was geared towards LGBT people. And again, I was facing this reality that most of the literature I was reading about going there for the World Cup and being in these big places was, don't be seen. If you're LGBT, don't show love for your partner. Don't be seen. Don't be known. Don't let anybody know who you are, because it could lead to violence. I think the other thing that's really telling about Russia is the rainbow flag is against the law there. It's considered anti-gay propaganda or anti-family propaganda, and you can serve 2 weeks in a prison for holding that flag out. My goal was to climb to the top of every mountain and hold the trans flag and show the world that I was proud of who I am. But that could put me in jail for 2 years, assuming the trans flag probably carries the same penalty as the gay flag. So I really couldn't hold that flag up there, but I got up there with my team and I wanted everybody to be safe. So again, I was in that place where I didn't say anything. I got on the ground, went to the mountain with the sole intention of climbing. I kept my head down and my eyes up. And I got to the top of the mountain, and that was my moment. Got to see the sunrise over Russia, and then I got out of there because Russia is not a safe place if you're LGBT, and I don't think I could go back at this point. Finally, it took another, at that point, about 6 months, 8 months, but I was on my way to my next peak, and this one was Aconcagua in South America. I wanted to climb. My journey was taking me towards that mountain next. And because of the seasons, that would be the next one. South America and us in Argentina, where Aconcagua sits, is a little bit nicer on paper if you're trans, or depending on your gender or your sexual orientation, because they have constitutional protections for the LGBT community. So this one felt better. But then when I dug a little bit deeper, I again found there's a lot of violence still in some of these areas towards the LGBT community. So again, I went in with this idea that I needed to kind of be silent in order to climb these mountains, this mountain in particular. The nice thing was I had family in Argentina. My cousins live in Buenos Aires. So I was they hadn't seen me. I visited them when I was in Patagonia in a different climbing life, maybe 10 years ago. And I visited them and we had a good relationship. They had come to the United States to live with me, but they're also very traditional. And I didn't know how they would accept me either. I had heard good things. They've always been super supportive. So I went down there and spent 17 days climbing to the top of that mountain. It was windy. It was the end of the season. I got on the last expedition I could because it was so hard to raise money and get that visible climb going. About 2/3 of our expedition backed out because of the wind and the weather concerns we had, but about 5 of us were able to still kind of trudge through and make it to the top. And it was right about Valentine's Day 2 years ago. This COVID year has got all of us kind of missing one whole year at a time. 2 years ago that I stood on the top of that mountain, and there I couldn't resist it. I busted that trans flag out and I didn't care. I had been silent. I had been not seen. I had been as low key as I could be on the mountain up until that point. But then I got to the top of the mountain and I opened my backpack up and I couldn't hide it anymore. At 23,000 feet, it's the highest mountain outside of the Himalayas. And except for a few small climbing teams who are trying to climb some of the Himalayas in the winter, I was standing the highest as anyone on the planet. So I busted that trans flag out and I held it as high as I could, just to kind of symbolically show the world that there I was, not hiding anymore. And I was going to take on all the conditions that it took to get there and still be who I am. And that was my last climb. I was scheduled to climb Denali last year, but they canceled the season. And here with 4 because of COVID, and there with 4 of the 7 summits climbed, I kind of turned back to training and all the things that we've been doing through social distancing to kind of keep ourselves active and keep ourselves engaged while we wait for the world to be kind of resilient and open back up again. The whole point of this, I suppose, is that happily ever after was never part of my story. Nobody ever told me that I was allowed to have happily ever after. That wasn't a way that trans stories ended. I'm still earning mine. It's not something that's easy. It's not an easy fairy tale that always ends like that. But still, I earn it one step at a time by climbing above the hate that I had to face to get to this point. As I look to the next 3 mountains, I've got Denali, I've got Vincent's Massif in Antarctica in the end of this year. And then Everest is that last climb. I mean, to see my dream come true and possibly have a chance to climb, to at least attempt all 7 of those highest peaks on each continent is amazing. And there's a couple of things I've learned. This journey was really only enabled when I took the first step out and away from my fear and out of the shadows and owned that greatest fear. And that was being seen. I had to not be afraid to be myself and let other people see me in order to be who I was and be able to do the things that I wanted to do. Retaking my narrative began by dumping the weight of the bricks that other people had put on my back, and instead building steps to get higher than the hate and stop them from putting those bricks on my back. I literally had to take it and repurpose it into something that I could use, motivation to get away from it. So I really think that I've used a lot of the abuse that I've taken and some of the negative narratives and really tried to climb on that and get higher to the high ground where I'm above the hate. Ironically, there's a lot of days when I think I'm fueled by that hate, and I still get up just to spite the people that want to throw that type of hate at me. But really, I can only climb so high on that spite and that hate. You can only get up so high on that kind of energy. The next portion of the journey when you climb, you need to do with love and the help of your friends and your support systems. These are the allies that get you through these things. You can climb almost the entire mountain with the support and of your friends and your allies. It'll get you so much higher than hate. But in the end of it all, I think that when you finish the climb, it really comes down to the strength that you have in your own heart. The ability to stand on the highest peak really comes from how strong your heart is. I really do wish everybody I come in contact with the right to climb their mountains, whatever they may be, unencumbered by the world's narrative for them. And I hope they all have a chance to look back at the haters and say, you better aim higher. With that in mind, that's kind of the end of what I like to kind of do as a presentation. I do want to leave people with the note that right now, in 25 states, legislators have proposed over 100 bills to restrict the rights of trans children and intimidate their families, sports teams, and doctors from supporting them. I couldn't have done what I did without having the outdoors and sports as a healing place when I needed it. And I also couldn't have done it without the allies that I had. My parents very early on decided that they would be my champions. Even though I was an adult, I was still their child, and they were still committed to being my champion. These children are fighting for their freedom to exist despite long odds. I never could have done it as a child. I saw what they faced. I know what it's like to stand there and hear the comments and hear the vitriol. They're still able to come out and ask to be themselves. Please take the time to research the long-term impact that these policies are going to have on these kids when they're asked to not be seen and to forego treatment or forego the opportunities that every other kid has to grow and to learn and to be part of the sports team. And remember that being an ally is as easy as just speaking up for these kids at this point. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. We have a question in the Q&A already, but if folks have more questions, I think now's a great time to send them through and we'll go through and answer them. Would you like me to read it for you, Erin?
Yeah, please.
Okay, great. So this question, what are the barriers that you face in the outdoors, specifically public lands or state land management agencies, or things that they should know about as agencies? What are barriers that they can perhaps help address?
Yeah, I'm going to go back quickly to what I just said about trans kids' access to sports, and then I'll talk specifically to the agencies. You know, sports are the feeder programs, sometimes to professional sports and sometimes to scholarships and stuff. But really, most of us, what we get from sports is the ability to figure out how to engage our bodies, figure out how to be active and to not be afraid to move or to challenge ourselves and to grow within our bodies. And 25% of the public land of all of the United States is in states now that are considering banning kids from sports. So if you're banning kids from sports in these spaces, you're ultimately down the road banning them from being in the outdoors. I mean, that's where they're going to end up in their lifetimes of athletics. So I would say a great way for anyone to encourage engagement with outdoor lands is to get kids active and healthy and looking for those spaces young in their lives. As far as the land managers now who are in places and are looking to do programs that'll help out, I think that there's a lot that you can look at. You could put, if you're doing a fireside chat, even with kids, to have a ranger just put pronouns on their badge or something would be huge. Some kids, you might know it or might not, might have different pronouns. I think that when you do medical training, I've gone through the woofer programs and all that stuff, and they get so gendered, and people get such an idea that medicine and gender come together. And in the wilderness setting, 95% of the problems that you're going to ever face really don't have anything to do with person's sex. So I would say, when you're doing those types of trainings, whether it be for wilderness medicine or anything else, remind people that, this might not matter. You might not need to know somebody's pronouns in order to serve them in the space that they're in. You might not need to have an awkward conversation with somebody about their body if they just need a Band-Aid for their toe. There's all of these things I think that come with just education and not making assumptions towards the people that come in. I would like to see more programming towards for kids in the outdoors, in the national parks and state parks that are maybe defined as gender gender, something that's gender expansive or something. But anything that we can basically do at this point that says you're welcome here without having to call somebody out, I think is a step in the right direction.
Awesome, thank you. We have another one. How has the mountaineering community welcomed you as a climber?
Well, it's been good. It's been tough, honestly. And I think that lately more it's been COVID that challenges it. My experience has definitely changed. I lost a lot of the kind of the machoist guys that I climbed with that were more about conquering mountains, if you will, and kind of had that whole narrative of overcoming nature and doing all of those things. But at the same time, my attitude is not as accepting towards that kind of toxic masculinity in the outdoors. I'm not as tolerant of it, and I'm not hiding anymore, so I don't have to be as tolerant of it. So I did lose friends. These days, it's great. We've been trying to, here in Denver, and I know in a lot of other places, we've been working with different, trying to find community and put community together and make events for community. A lot of queer people find that they would only go to bars. So we're trying to, but then there are a lot of queer climbers. So we're trying to connect different queer climbers. And then one thing, I think it comes down to the brands that support us. When I was first doing this, I used to go out to all the film festivals. You never see a movie like mine. But yeah, we made a movie, and there's other movies like mine. There are other queer people being represented in outdoor media. So even, beyond kind of my friends, those I had to kind of redevelop or remake those relationships. In a lot of cases, they ended up stronger, and sometimes the relationship just went away and I'm better off for it. But in a lot of ways, the industry has changed and embraced us too, to the point that, I'm sponsored by Mammoth. I did a film with Meryl. REI has been a big supporter of me through some of these first climbs. And, that there's been a lot of recent interest and reception for me that have made it good. And I think I get a lot of contact from even around the world, people saying, boy, I saw your story and I never thought that this was possible. So I think we are making a little bit of a difference. We got a long way to go, but we're making a difference.
Awesome. Okay, we have another one. This one says, Erin, thank you for sharing with us. This is so inspiring. A number of us are here today are outdoor professionals who work directly with youth and others who face barriers to the outdoors. What advice would you have as we work to make our programs and opportunities inclusive and open? And what proactive steps can we take to be more inclusive organization and community?
Yeah, I think it's important when you're putting your activities together to kind of think outside of the male and female. When I was a kid, everything lined up male on one side, female on the other, and none of the two shall meet kind of thing. And I think it's important to kind of I think for the greater good, even for people who aren't trans or gender nonconforming or something, that everybody is able to interact on an equal level, right? When everybody's doing the same thing and not separated and kind of doing different things, I think we're doing good things. The guys and the girls have to be kind of doing equal activities. And I'm shocked at how many times I'll hear somebody's summer camp stories tell me that like the boys are outside shooting arrows and the girls are cleaning they're doing the clean latrine award, and just, we got to get away from things like that. And it seems so basic, but here we are in 2021. And somebody just told me that a couple of weeks ago. They said, yeah, my kid went to summer camp and the boys were outside, swimming or something. And the girls were cleaning the bathroom and they had an award for whoever could get it the cleanest. And I was like, How are we still doing this? But, I think that, it doesn't take a lot. I think, small actions go a long way. And I think the separation is really something we've got to get away from. And it's not fair to say, like, even the guys that identify as guys want to be macho and tough and conquer nature. They might want to do some of the things that they haven't had a chance to do at home. So I would be open-minded to listening to people and their experience and allow that. I will do a plug for Wilderness Inquiry's next speaker series, or one that's coming up, and that's with Perry Cohen, who runs youth camps. And I think everybody here who's in that position where they're trying to work with youth should really sign themselves up for that next talk, because Perry works with kids and works with trans and non-conforming and LGBT kids, and he's a master at it. He's a master at all of the things that you need to do to make kids feel comfortable and engaged in the outdoors and feel like their experience in the outdoors is the same as the one that most people were granted. So I'd encourage listening on him.
Awesome, thank you. A couple more. Do you have recommendations about how to respond in a group setting if people ask why is it important to share pronouns in a way that people can quickly understand and hopefully embrace?
Yeah, this is another one of those situations where I think people think that they're saying the pronouns for me, and I have to remind myself to say pronouns, because I don't, it's not something that I don't naturally most of the time get misgendered, and I have to remember that I was in a place where I needed it too. So yes, it was beneficial when I was not trans to know that I was living in a safe space. But my father is also not trans, and he's an ally of mine. And when somebody says that their pronouns, my father, who doesn't have an LGBT bone in his body, I don't believe, I don't know, but when he hears somebody say pronouns, he knows that as my advocate, he's safe. Same thing with my coworkers. When they hear somebody else use my pronouns, they all know how to work with me. And some of them are, maybe I work in real estate and construction. So that's a whole nother amount of baggage, but, in that industry, but still when people say that, in a construction meeting, and they have their pronouns in their meeting sign on or something, that tells all of my coworkers that I'm in a safe space, and their friends, they're the people I spend 8 days a week with, or 8 hours of 5 days a week with. These are the people that, I spend a lot of my time with, and they're protective of me, and they are open and want me to have a safe work environment. So when you say that, you're not just making trans people feel safe or gender non-conforming people feel safe, you're making their families feel safe and their friends feel safe, and you're letting people feel safe that you don't even know are there. So, my dad, the conservative, hears pronouns and he appreciates it.
That's great. That same attendee also wanted to say, thank you so much for being so authentic, vulnerable, and real to share this presentation with us.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate nice audiences for sure. So thank you.
I have a question too.
Huh?
When I think about, your story and your journey is full of what to me feels like mountains of their own, like these enormous challenges in society and in your life and in everything. And I can't comprehend how a person would prepare for that, but I also am just curious, how do you literally prepare for climbing literal mountains? Like, what does that entail, as you're planning to attempt, Denali and Everest? Like, what does your training look like?
Yeah, a lot of it was mental to begin with. I can't believe I left the country. Honestly, I got beat up in my own neighborhood on my way, and I try not to tell the story, but I did get assaulted in my own neighborhood on my way to Africa. So I was between Kosciuszko and Tanzania. And I got assaulted by 4 college kids. And I live in a very liberal area in Denver. And you'd think that, for me to do what I'm doing in my neighborhood would be fine. But once I start getting on airplanes and going places, it might be difficult. So a lot of it is mental, honestly. And there's been a lot of fear I've had to get over. And a lot of deep breaths I've had to take. Even public speaking right now is so hard for me. But I think the training then becomes the easy part, right? And it's just consistent. I'm out 6 days a week. I'm in the gym 2 days a week, and then 4 days a week I'm climbing, usually pretty slowly, at a moderate pace with a very heavy pack on my back. And sometimes I go for 2 hours and I have a heavy weight, and sometimes I go for 12 hours and I have kind of a lightweight, and kind of my coach and my trainer kind of keep it moving and keep it different. And I don't know, it doesn't matter how hard I prepare. I'm always a little bit scared to go on that next mountain, because, it's like, no matter how prepared you are, you can't prepare for so many things that you face when you get into the wilderness. So you try as hard as you can to be prepared, and then hope for a little luck along the way.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
I have another question. What made you want to start climbing mountains? Mountaineering seems like one of the most intense things to me.
Yeah. I liked, there were two aspects of that I really look back on and appreciate the outdoors for providing. The first is kind of that therapy, or that place to go. I think I'm guessing a lot of the people that we've got on this call, or people that'll leave or listen to this call, are going to the outdoors for therapy and to connect and to kind of get the downtime and to just put the phone down and find that restorative kind of place. I think secondly, you build friendships, right? Those are the best friendships that you can make on the outdoors. Nothing really helps build a friendship like, putting on your avalanche beacon and then committing to like the biggest climb ever, knowing that the person you're going to climb with is really in charge of your life and your decision making, and you have to move at the same kind of decision making, with the same decision making and the same, like ability, and kind of have the same ideas of what fun is going to be. So the relationships that you build in those spaces, I think, are really unique to mountaineering, whether it be skimo or rock climbing, or just going out and climbing a 14er in Colorado. So I think that's really what attracted me to it. When I was in transition, I think really, at the time I was kind of losing mountain climbing friends, and hadn't had a chance to restock mountain climbing friends. And I really needed that restorative space. So I always look back and say, like, I think I stuck with it because I realized kind of the healing power of the outdoors. And that's really what got me through some really tough times.
What comes next? Once you're done with Everest, what is your next big challenge?
As much as I talk about, it's Trans Day of Visibility next week. And I tried to feather in the themes of the fact that visibility is so powerful for trans people now. And Trans Day of Visibility is so important because it allows us to supersede the narratives that were given to us and show other trans people and the cisgender world, that trans people aren't the narrative that we thought they were. So Trans Day of Visibility to me is this huge thing, and visibility means a lot. But still, I kind of look at my life and say, wouldn't it just be nice to not be visible sometimes? Wouldn't it be nice just to kind of just be another girl at the crag? And I think that, or in the Alpine, and I think that a lot of my goal in life is to kind of, once this is done and this story is searchable and people can find it and see that something like this is possible, even if you're trans, I think I've kind of already won. So I guess my next big challenge might be to learn French. I don't know.
That also sounds really hard. So I think
right. I'm terrible with languages, but something like that. I would love to sail across the Pacific Ocean. Has been one of my things that I've really wanted to do for a long time. So I might have to overcome my fear of a bathing suit and learn how to sail. So who knows? I mean, it could be anything.
Cool. Well, we've got just a few comments I wanted to pass along from the crowd. Someone says, Erin, you are so incredible. Thank you so much for sharing your journey with us. We also have, Erin, I first heard about you through the Out There podcast episode, Out of the Shadows, and I was excited to see your name appear in the lineup of the Wilderness Inquiry series. Thank you so much for sharing your inspiring and deeply touching story. We also have Erin. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I am part of the LGBTQ community and I really look up to you. You sharing your struggles makes me feel less alone. We also have, you are an engaging, incredible, and inspiring speaker making such an impact. Thank you for your courage, honesty, and passion by sharing to ensure all people are seen through your extraordinary goals, achievements, life lessons. I've learned so much from your presentation. I'm committed to being a better ally. Thank you. I just wanted to ask too, kind of on that last one, as we think about allyship and what that means and making space for folks with different identities and abilities and backgrounds in the outdoors, do you have any kind of final words of advice for allies in these spaces that could help make them more welcoming for people with different identities?
Yeah, I definitely, first off, I want to thank my allies. I wouldn't be here without them. I would not be able to do, I wouldn't be here to do this presentation. A lot of people, as I alluded to earlier, heard my story, and the 20 seconds it took me to sweat it out and said, awesome. I'm so happy I get to know 100% of you. And they did it without a seam or without, it was just seamless. And it was profound. It was cathartic to know that people were going to accept me no matter what, at that point. So I think that being ready and being ready to understand somebody that's in that situation might take thought beforehand. It might take open-mindedness beforehand. You might have to think, what if, my friend came out, and maybe be okay with it? Because eventually you probably will know somebody that's going to come out. 2% of people on this planet are trans. That's as many people as have AB blood type, and that's as many people who are redheads, natural redheads. So we're out there, whether you know it or not. Whether we choose to come out, it's a different story. So be supportive when they come out. The other thing is, you never know that a trans person's standing there, right? So I worked in my job for 15 years or 14 years, and I heard all kinds of things in the office that were negative at the water cooler. Nobody ever stood up and said, is that right to say? I mean, if not in life, like in the office, like, is that appropriate? Saying that challenges the bully, and it would have let me know, like, oh, somebody's thinking about these things, but most of the time that's not how it went. So, and I'm just as guilty of it. I had a boss come up to me once, say I was out climbing a 14er and I saw this trans woman, and you could tell she was trans and he went down this litany of things. He had studied her body, and he had all these lists of things that he said, and I was quiet. I didn't say anything. I was like, well, I'm glad she was out there having a good time. Or how much more amazing could it be to see someone in the outdoors and enjoying themselves and being themselves? Like, that's the response you have to have for the bully, is to turn it around on them and say, no, that person's not in the wrong, you are. So I think that allies really, when they speak up, whether they know it or not, they're making an impact. Because like I said before, it might not be me that's in the room, or you might not know that there's a trans person in the room, but there might be a trans person's mother in the room. There might be a trans person's sister in the room. There might be a trans person's cousin, and they're hurt by those comments too. So what I would say is, stand up to the bully when they say something at the water cooler or wherever it is that makes the space not safe for the LGBT community in general. I think we've almost stopped saying that's so gay at this point as a bad, in the bad way. But there's a lot of things like that where people their language is hostile towards gay people. And I think when you say, hey, I have gay friends, or I don't think that that's a good way to talk about people that, that are part of our community, that is taking the power from the bully and taking it back for the safer space. So that's what I would recommend for allies.
Thank you so much, Erin. We are out of time today, but I'm so thankful that you joined us. So it was really exciting to have you. I loved hearing your story. I hope that we'll stay connected in the future, and I can't wait to hear more about your continuing adventure and your mountain climbing and everything on the horizon for you. And for those of you watching, feel free to check out Erin's website, transcending7.org, to learn more about her mission and work. And check us out next month with our next speaker series. We'd love to see you all there.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.